So for many years, I taught high school. 15 years, I taught adolescents. I learned something among many things that I learned teaching adolescents. But one thing I learned is, as I watched them migrating the hallways of my school and sitting in my classroom, one of the things I learned is they're all looking for a place to belong. They were all trying to figure it out. Sometimes they did it by the clothes they wore, sometimes it was by the language they spoke, sometimes music, whatever. They were always trying to figure out where they belonged. Then after I taught high school, I came to Concordia University and I started working with older people. And so now we're at post-high school, now we're into college, and now they lived in dorms, and I had them in class, and they could stay up late, and they could drive cars wherever they wanted to drive their cars. And I found out that they were also trying to figure out where they belonged. So I wanted them to get jobs when they graduated, because that's a really good thing. And so I would help them prepare for getting a job, but in the end of it, they were always asking these questions of who am I really, and where do I belong, and what am I supposed to do with my life? Then after I finished up with Concordia, that was a dozen years, then I started working in the congregational ministry, kind of like a pastor sort of guy, and I did that for the last 12 years, and I'm going to tell you something. I've learned that, wow, now I'm working with older people, that's like you and me, and what did I discovered? They're also trying to figure out where do they belong, and where's my place, and what am I going to be when I grow up, and so on and so on and so on. And what I found out is I don't care if you're young, or you're a little bit older, or you're older, we're all asking the same question. Where do we actually belong? Who are we? And what's my place? Does that make sense? Makes a lot of sense to me. There's a story in Genesis chapter 25 that's quite striking, and as a result, I'm going to use this word, quite insidious. In Genesis 25, we have Jacob and we have Esau, two brothers. Any of you have siblings? Raise your hands. You got siblings? Oh, good. All right, how many of you fight with your sibling? Yeah, and what's so funny is even as adults, we still fight. We just try to do it civilly. When I grew up with my brother, there's still damage around my house from when we would fight. But now as adults, we don't duke it out. We just don't talk to each other. And so the fact of the matter is, we have a sibling thing going on in Genesis 25, and it's between Jacob and it's between Esau. Esau comes in from hunting. He's a stud. Scripture describes him as kind of ruddy, outdoorsy sort of looking guy. His name means, Esau means red. So he's just kind of the guy who was sunburned, the guy. And then there was Jacob, the wimp. So you have Esau's out hunting, and he comes in from hunting, and he's famished. Now, point to me made here, Esau was not starving to death. Some of you right now, I know right now at 11:29, you are famished. And if you don't get out of church soon, you're going to eat the chair in front of you. And I know that. There are those that get famished. That's the Esau hunger. Esau was not going to starve to death. He wasn't gaunt and desperate to die. He's going to die if he doesn't get something. He came in from hunting, and he was really, really hungry. His brother, Jacob, the manipulator, is making some stew. We know it's lentil stew. Some of you will know the story. And so as the hungry guy comes in and looks at his brother, who is not ruddy and tough, but soft-skinned, he looks at his brother Jacob and says, hey, can I have a bowl of stew? Jacob says, I'll give it to you for your birthright. Esau was the firstborn. I'll give you a bowl of stew for your birthright. And Esau says, what? Yeah, I'll give you a bowl of soup for a birthright. I mean, you're really hungry, so I can give you some soup and everything will be cool, and I get your birthright. Now, they're young men. Dad wasn't anywhere near dying. And so Esau said, okay, give me a bowl of soup. You can have my birthright. Who cares? But it says in Scriptures, it uses this very, very interesting statement. It says that Esau despised his birthright. Scripture speaks it with this horrible mandate that when Esau chose to give up his birthright for a bowl of soup, hear this, he gave up his place to where he belonged. And as I've said already, everybody is looking at the place they belong. Where do I belong? What is my place? And some of us in here today are saying, I don't know what my place is. Well, Esau did know, and he gave it up. That's the striking thing about the prodigal son. You see, when you get to the prodigal son, what you get to are two boys and a dad. Each boy takes on a particular posture. You have the young boy who always gets the bad marks because he's the guy who asks for the inheritance and wishes his dad to be dead, and he wishes for the inheritance, give me my inheritance, I want to go do what I want to do. And then you have the other boy who seems like the good boy. He's the one that stays home and does all the work, and he does all the chores, and he honors his dad, he's obedient to his dad, and he's just the good guy. So you got these two sons, and of course you got the father. The son comes up and he asks his dad for his inheritance. Of course, you all know what that means when you ask for an inheritance. What you're really saying is that my dad is dead. Because isn't that when you get an inheritance? You get an inheritance when your parent dies. And so they're saying, when my parent dies, I want my inheritance, but he says, I want mine early. Give me my inheritance early. And so the story, and you can imagine the listeners to the story, the listeners who are people who are wanderers, they don't maybe know where they belong, and then you have some people called the Pharisees, very religious people, and they kind of know where they belong. And so Jesus is telling this story, and each of them is trying to say, well, which son am I? And where do I belong? They're listening to the story of the kid asked for his inheritance, and they're all scandalous. I mean, it's just a scandalous thing to say, Dad, give me my inheritance. That means you're dead, but that's okay because I want my money. And you know what the story says? The story says that this young man took the money and he went off to a distant land, and then, I love this description, he lived a life of wild living. Quote, unquote. Wild living. Now, you define what wild living is by your own life experience, but he called it wild living. You see, what the younger son did is he forgot where he belonged too. So you have Esau who forgot where he belonged, and now you have a younger boy in a story told by Jesus that they question of where do you belong? And it is an important story because each of us does have that question mark inside of where we belong. Where do we actually attach ourselves? We call it, in psychology world, they say, where's your sense of place? Your sense of place. I taught at Concordia last semester. I had to teach a Religion 100 class. They asked me to come in and do it. I had 27 students at 12:35 in the afternoon. They were awake and they did come. Sometimes if the class is early, they don't come. But this was midday, they were there. And I was teaching freshmen. The goal of the class, you'll love this, the goal of the class is to teach the whole Bible in one semester. Sometimes by the time you get to Revelation, you simply say, there's a revelation, and then you're done. But in the middle of the class, I get to know the students. I really do get to kind of connect with them, and I do find out something about their lives. And there's one kid that I talked to, his name was Jonathan. And Jonathan and I talked a little bit during the semester. He was a bit of a quiet kid. He sat in the back left-hand corner of the room. And I'm going to tell you, in my class, when you sit in the back left-hand part of the room, that's the signal. And he'll tell you this. I go back at some point in the semester and say, it's so nice that you've decided to sit in the farthest place in the classroom away from the instructor. What message are you sending me? And then they always go, well, I'm just sitting in the back corner. As far away from me as you can. I get it. Well, this kid, Jonathan, liked that, and we laughed, and we started talking, and then at one point we had an extended conversation, and he began to tell me his story. And it's a pretty provoking story. And it's a story I'm going to share with you today through videotape. Now, there are going to be 3 video segments that I'm going to show you in this message. So you'll love this. When we get to the 3rd video, you know we're almost done. Because you always wonder, when's the guy done? You'll know. We'll be almost done. But what I want you to look at in the story, I want you, as I give this story to you, this is not just a story of hearing a guy's testimony of his life. That's part of it. But really what I want you to do is this. As you're listening, look for the language of belonging. Look at the language of what is a sense of place. And then think, as you're listening to these 3 clips, then think about your sense of place and your sense of belonging. And see how this fits. Because he has a pretty interesting story. And I think you're going to appreciate it, and I think you're going to go home and talk about it today, because I think it's a really good story. Because it's not like it's an extreme story. It's a really good story that any of us could imagine happening. So let's listen to the first video. Really, you're going to watch it.
Originally, I was born in Florida, and I currently live in Fort Wayne, Indiana.
So you live in Fort Wayne, Indiana, 2.5 hours away.
Yes, sir.
You ended up in Concordia University.
Yes, sir. I was born in Cape Coral, Florida. It's close to Fort Myers, south part of Florida. When I was born, my biological mother, she was a drug addict and alcoholic as well. Soon after I was born, she was taken away to jail, and she was heavily into drugs. And as soon as I was born, she gave me up for adoption instantly because she didn't want to have to deal with having me in her life. And then she made the decision to give me up, and then she was taken off to jail. So basically after that, when you're given up by biological parents, you're put into the system. And for my situation, I was put in a few foster homes. I really only remember one. I lived in this house with 10 other boys, and the two parents, the mom was really nice to me. The 10 other boys were all older than me. I was the youngest out of 10 of them. I was anywhere between 2 to 4, 1 to 4.
Okay, and you were there for a while. You were there for a while.
Yeah, I was there for the majority of my time in foster care.
So they placed you, but not as an infant, but when you got a little bit older.
Yeah.
They placed you in this home with 10 other boys.
Yeah.
And then you have the foster mom and dad, and they were good people?
Yeah, they really did their best to provide all 10 of us with adequate living conditions. I mean, I was the youngest out of all 10 of them, and with being the youngest, there were a couple of older boys there who lived there, and I would always get picked on, and they actually beat me up quite a bit. And there was actually a point where one of them bit me on the top of the head, and they had to call the police. And I always knew, deep down, I didn't really belong there. I just knew that this wasn't, even at such a young age, I could tell, none of these people were, a part of my life. I was just placed there. I was just kind of living in a crappy hotel or something like that. I knew I didn't belong there, and that wasn't my place at the time, and I was kind of just living life.
So you hear the story. We have a boy who's born to a mom who's a drug addict. She gives birth to him. He is immediately put into foster care, and she goes to jail. He never sees her again, and he hasn't to this day seen his birth mother. He gets placed into the foster care system. He has nothing bad to say about the foster care system. Andrew Osborne and I went into this kid's dorm room, which was pretty funny in itself because he had to clean the room. And then Andrew, when you do a video with Andrew, that means you bring in 2 cameras and you have lights into this little dorm room, which was pretty sweet for this kid. He was overwhelmed by all of this because he tells the story, but he's not looking for attention through the story. I just want you to know, you can see in his demeanor, he's not looking for attention. And we come in and we kind of overwhelm his dorm room for an hour, and we get a lot of video feed. And some of the things that, of course, we had to edit it down to make it work for worship today. But I can tell you that when he was put into foster care, he did speak of being cared for and that he was watched over. He was not neglected. This is not a bad story about foster care. This is about a young boy born, placed into foster care, and then at 4 or 5 years old, and that's the story he's telling there, is he's 4 or 5 years old now, and he's been in foster care for nearly 5 years, and he's adjusting to it, but inside of him there's a voice that simply says, I don't know if I belong here. I don't know if this is what my life is to be. Now he defines it in the language of a 4-year-old, and now he's 18, and he's looking back at what it means to be 4, but he's asking, is this my place? Is this where I actually should be? And there's an emptiness in that 4-year-old's life. Maybe some of you can appreciate what that means. You appreciate that loss. Appreciate that emptiness. But I do have this question for you too as well, and this is really striking to me as I think about my own life. The question of, do I take for granted my place that's been given to me? Do I take it for granted? Do I just assume that it is what it is, and I kind of deserve it, and it's just kind of the way it is, and I just assume things about my life, and when you take it for granted, you can also neglect it, right? So when you take something for granted, you can just assume that that's the way it's supposed to be, and you can neglect it. We know that with parents and children. You watch a child, I've seen this particularly in girls, don't get mad at me, boys do this too, but I'll see it in 12 and 13-year-old girls who are duking it out with their moms. It's usually their moms. And it goes on for a few years. We know that. We just, adolescent psychology, 12 to 15 years old, 12 to 16 years old, and any mom who's raised girls can attest to that, and if you're a girl, you can attest to what you did to your mother. And then you need to go apologize. It's just kind of the rite of passing. This is kind of what happens, and so you duke it out. And one of the reasons we know in psychology, adolescent psychology, that this is appropriate is because a child feels secure enough. They're self-differentiating, and they feel secure enough with their parent. They know where they belong, and they know they have a sense of place, that they're given the freedom to fight because they know they won't be ostracized and kicked out. So they know their sense of place. But what if you don't know your sense of place? What if you just what we take for granted, my friend Jonathan can't take for granted. And now you feel a bit lost. And maybe today there's someone here that's feeling a bit lost. And as much as you take it for granted, some of us can't. We don't know where we belong. So let's see the second videotape, and let's see what happens with Jonathan.
My first encounter with my mom and dad, that they're my parents now, they're my mom and dad, they always will be. I was sitting actually in the living room of my foster home, and I was playing video games. I actually still remember like what was on the screen when they walked in. So the door, someone knocks on the door, and my foster parents open up the door, and there's two people standing there. And I didn't know who they were, and they came in, and they kind of like looked at me and they spoke, and then that was my first encounter. Then I don't remember what happened after that. But then my second encounter, they took me to a place. It was McDonald's. I didn't know at the time, but we showed
That's
up
a
at
nice
McDonald's.
place. We went to a McDonald's.
Yeah, and another van pulls up, and then another car pulls up.
Okay.
Out of the van steps out a person who I'd never met before, and there was a little girl with her, and then the two people that would end up as my parents walked out of the car. I walk out with my foster parents, and then this little girl with the individual that was taking care of her walks out, and my parents talked to my future parents talked to me, and they bought me a Happy Meal, and they bought this little girl a Happy Meal. It was real cool because at that moment, someone who I'd never met before, I later found out that it was my little sister who I'd never met before.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and she was in the same situation as me. She's a year and a half younger than me, and she was taken away from our biological parents as well. So at that moment, it was kind of weird for me because I suddenly had a little sister. It was really cool.
So you belonged.
Yeah, suddenly I went from having not a place and no one really in my life to now I had someone, a little piece of hope what I have today.
Oh my gosh.
So basically from that, I don't remember too much. I do remember along the way, my parents, who are my mom and dad, of course, they really fought hard for my sister and I to be together, because when you're separated in the state of Florida, as far as I know, you're not, it's really hard to get them together, especially two little children who have like a background of like bad history or whatever it may be. It's really hard to get them together. Then I remember one day in court, when it was all said and done after months of fighting, I remember the judge holding me in one arm and my sister in another, and my parents were standing on either side, and we take the first picture of us as like finally adopted, and I still have like that picture somewhere in my house back in Fort Wayne, and like that picture helps bring back some memories of like that day, because I remember me in my little white shirt and red tie, and like my sister in her nice little dress, and that was like the first day like we were a family, and it was a really cool feeling. It was like my new life was right ahead of me at the age of 5, and it was like the greatest feeling. So as soon as I was adopted, I was soon baptized. Might have been a week or so later. I remember they called my godmother down from Atlanta, Georgia, and I got to meet her for the first time. It was really cool because like after that, I could start my faith walk, and my parents were there with me every step of the way.
Do you see the detail of a 4-year-old? He remembers he wore a white shirt and a red tie. He remembers, this is kind of cute, this isn't in the videotape. He remembers when he met his not his birth parents, but his adoptive parents, they came to the McDonald's. You heard the McDonald's. And then his foster parents bring him to McDonald's, and then unknown to him, he has a sister, and these foster parents bring the sister there. And he said, we go into McDonald's, and they get us a Happy Meal. And he said, you know how at McDonald's they have little children's tables? And he said they got their little Happy Meals, and they're carrying their little Happy Meals over to their table. And this 4-year-old looks at his sister who's like 2 years old, and what he does is he opens up her Happy Meal, and he takes a little hamburger, and he puts it down in front of her, and then he takes a little French fries and puts it in a little spot, and he takes a little drink, and he puts it in a little spot, and then he goes over and does the same thing on his side, hamburger and French fries and drink, and then he realizes that he's just become a brother. He realizes he's become a brother. I said to him, so Jonathan, when you go to McDonald's today and you get a quarter-pounder meal, do you put the hamburger in this spot, the drink in this side, and the French fries in that spot? He started laughing. He goes, I do. That's exactly what I do. It was already implanted. This is where hamburgers belong. He figured out his place. Stands with the judge, has a picture, and he knows he has a place. Let's look at this Bible verse, and I want you to say it with me, please, from Galatians. But when the fullness of time had come, goodness, you see what happened when the time was full, the fullness of time. For Jonathan, his fullness of time came when a mom and dad stepped into his life and said, we want you to be our child. You belong to us. That's when the time was full. But for us, please put that verse back up. I don't want that to go away so fast. You see, the reason is because sometimes I forget that, I think we all forget that when God's time was full, he sent his son, and we are adopted as his children. We become the sons and daughters of the King of the universe. That Christ Jesus came in the fullness of time and sent forth his Son. Notice this, born of a woman, became like us, born under law, the weightiness of our world, to redeem those who were under the law. That's us. And why? So that we could we were adopted to become the sons and daughters of God. The sons and daughters of God. We didn't have a place, and now we have a place. Jonathan didn't have a place, and now he had a family. And it was striking to him. And notice what the very first thing that the family did with this little boy and this little girl, they got the child adopted, because that adoption of sons and daughters, they got that child baptized. They go to the church, and he talks about the baptism, and they go to the font, and he's baptized. But he says he's 4 years old. He looks into the font, and what he notices in the font is there's ants. And what he was concerned about is that the ants would drown. I'm thinking, why are there ants in the baptismal font? I can guarantee you right now, there are no ants in this baptismal font. But that's what he remembers as a 4-year-old. And then you see, did the faith take? Absolutely. He realized he became an adopted child of God, adopted to a family, literally in his home, but also now to faith. And that faith became real in his life, and it became something. You see, when you look at the prodigal son, we have things that are very predictable and some things that are unpredictable. The predictable is this. Thank you for the verse. The predictable is this. First of all, you have the younger son who goes off on a life of wild living. That story is very common, by the way. We hear these all the time. Sometimes I wish, when we go into the stories of wild living, there's always damage. There's guilt and shame, there's pain, and some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. When you go off in a life of wild living, there's always stuff that you carry. You just carry it in your lives, and it's a sad, sad thing. That's what this guy did. But I'm going to tell you, that's kind of predictable. In fact, for us who are older and we look at the younger, we try to rescue people from making those stupid decisions. That's part of our task. And I'm going to tell you, it's part of my task as a pastor. I don't want to see people go off a cliff. Please do not go off a cliff. But people will choose to do that. They'll choose to go off a cliff. And you go, man, here we do. The story goes over and over and over again. And that's the prodigal son. He paints a story. Jesus paints the story. But everybody who's listening, they'll go, oh, yeah, we get it. We get it. Some of us did that. I did it. Let me tell you, I did that. I'm a wild living guy. No, I'm not. I'm kind of boring. And so then you have the other son. And the other son is also predictable. He's the good kid. He stays home. He does everything by rules and obligation. You tell him what to do, he does it. He's the A student. A students drive me nuts. I'm married to one. Because they do everything really, really well. They do it really, really well. But oftentimes the motivation to why they're an A student is based on rules and not on excellence. It's based on fulfilling an obligation and not performing because you want to do something really, really good. Just because God's given you a gift and you want to excel. That's the older son. It's very predictable. So he gets really angry because the wild living boy comes home and the dad does a party for him. And he's saying, look at me. I've worked really, really hard. I deserve attention. But that's all rule-based. That's not grace-based. And if you live by rules, I'm just going to tell you, you live by rules, you can never, ever fulfill the rules enough. You can't. That's why we have to be adopted children of God, because we can't fulfill the law. We can never fulfill it. But of course, in the middle of all this is a father. And what I find so striking with the father, there are four little points here that I found quite striking to the father with this story. First of all, his baby boy wants his inheritance. He wants his inheritance. And what does the father do? He gives it to him. You don't see anything in the story where the father argues with the boy. He simply gives him the inheritance. The second thing is he doesn't reject the son. You want the inheritance. You wish me dead. I love you. Here's your inheritance. The son chooses to go off in wild living. The father didn't push him out of the house. The father didn't kick him out. He chose to make a life decision that was going to haunt him. And third, there is simply no anger or resentment on the part of the father. You just don't see any of that stuff. You just don't see it. There's just a father who loves his boy. And fourth, the son comes back, and the father runs to the boy. Now, you got to understand something. In the ancient world, men don't run. They don't run like that. They had long robes, Middle Eastern robes, so they kept cool during the day, warm at night. But a man would never lift their robes up to run. That was considered humiliation. So men didn't do that. And certainly if you were a man, if you were the father, kind of a patriarch of a home, and you had the highest of respect, you would never, ever lift up your robe and run. And it says in the text, that's why this text is so, so profound. It says in the text that the father was always looking for the son. He was always looking for him. He never, ever rejected the son. He did not cast him away. If you feel that you have been cast away from God, that's the wrong message. That's not Scripture. That is not grace. God does not desert his people. We can desert him. He does not desert you. He does not. And so here's the father looking for his son, and he sees his son coming. And it says he ran to his son. To the audience of Jesus' day listening to that, that was scandalous. That was incredible. That was overwhelming. And then when the father reaches to the son, he hugs the son, and the son is ready to say, I don't deserve to be your boy. Just let me be one of your hired hands. But the father won't hear it. The father embraces the son and hugs him and kisses him. And then it says this, he calls for a party, one thing. Two, he says, here, take my robe. The robe was the clothing of honor. Here's my ring. It was the sign of authority in the household. Wear some sandals. Sandals were the sign of sonship. You are my son. You belong to me. You are not rejected. You are not cast away. You who lived the life that took you away from me, you have returned. And one who was lost is now found. Of course, you have the other boy, the kid who lives by obligation. He gets angry because of grace. See, when you live by laws and rules, you don't like grace. You don't like it. What you want is to fulfill every iota of the law. If you want an A, just tell me how to get an A. I'll write the paper so I get an A. No heart, no passion, no joy. Just fulfill the obligation. And so the son looks at the dad and says, listen, I've done everything you've expected of me. I am your A student. And yet you give him a party, but you've never done it for me. Self-righteousness, no grace, simply obligation and rules. You can choose which son you are. You can choose. If faith for you is simply following a system of rules, and that'll make God happy, sorry. If you're the one that's got a testimony of wild living, whatever that definition is, by the way, and you've come home and you do what that boy did. It says in the text, he had a contrite heart. He broke and repented, and his heart changed. It changed. We have one more video clip, and I want you to listen to this one. And it's so striking, and maybe something that you can carry with you today.
When I was adopted, my parents received like a file. When you're adopted, the parents that you're given to get a file of everything previously. My sister got one, and I had one as well. And in my file, the people really didn't believe in me, like the social workers and everything. They gave me a 0% chance of graduating high school. If I ever would miraculously get out of high school, I would never make it into any college. They said I would never be socially acceptable, that I would never be good at any sports, that I would never be a normal kid, and that I'd always be behind the 8 ball my whole life. They pretty much labeled me ever since I was a little kid, and they never really gave me a shot in the world. And despite that, my parents still adopted me, and now I go to Concordia University in Arbor.
You went to college?
Yeah, I graduated in the top 5% of my class in my high school. I have a lot of great friends that have always been there for me, and I'm very blessed to have them in my life. I play soccer here at the university as well. I throw the javelin for our track and field team. I've accomplished so much that I'm just so blessed that God has given me all these talents and abilities that I can go out and honor Him by doing it. So it's really such a great experience for me that my parents believed in me, and they got me started on my faith walk, and they're still walking with me every step of the way. And then they've given me the tools in life to go out and show other people God's love, and that no matter what people label you or how hard of a time you're going through in life, that He'll always be there for you, and no label can ever outdo what Jesus has in mind for you.
You see the tears in his eyes? Maybe you didn't see it. I sat there. Andrew was videoing it. I think Andrew was going to start crying too. I get choked up every time. I've heard it a couple of times. I still get choked up. He gets choked up. They open up a file before he's adopted that says he will be a miserable failure in life. Do not adopt this child. 0 socialization, 0 academic skills. Everything is a 0. You can't make it. And his parents read the file and they closed it. And they said, "This is our son." Oh, for a sake of a God who says the very same thing to you and me. The file is closed. You are my daughter. You are my son. No labels. No hidden entrapment. No surprise. You are my child. My friends, wherever you are today, wherever you are in your walk, that firstborn son, maybe that's your wrestling, maybe the wild living son. You are all children of God. And He loves you for exactly who you are. You have a place to belong. You have an inheritance in the heavens, a gift given to you by God Himself. Amen. In Christ's name, amen.